All right. Hey, welcome everyone to another episode of Daily Coronavirus-Driven Mind Stuff. My name is George Ortega, and it is Wednesday, April 22nd. This show is on White Plains Community Media at 5 p.m. Monday through Friday, and you can find episodes on their internet site and eventually on YouTube. All right, today is going to be somewhat, it's going to start at least on a sobering tone. And basically, I want to talk about a podcast that I heard that was published on Monday by the New York Times. The New York Times has a daily podcast called The Daily. And on April 20th, the title of the podcast was "The Next Year, parentheses or two, close parentheses, of the pandemic." So in it, the host interviews a science and health reporter for the New York Times. His name is Donald G. McNeil Jr. And what he says is truly sobering. It gives us an idea of what we're facing, that really neither the Republicans nor the Democrats nor the mainstream media is focusing too much on. I mean, it's good the New York Times came out with this piece, but most media outlets are not being this forthright, this truthful with what our situation is. So let me again, if you don't have a pencil or pen nearby, I would definitely suggest you get one. The title again is "The Next Year or Two of the Pandemic," and the podcast is called The Daily, and it was published on April 20th, on Monday. So I will repeat this again one or two more times during the show, so you can go and find a pen and paper now if you need to. But let me just briefly go through the major points that were made. The first one is that, people have been saying we may get a vaccine for this within a year. And so what O'Neill informs us of is that the fastest vaccine that has ever been developed was developed in the 1950s, and it took 4 years to develop. Now, he does acknowledge that we have better technology now, but basically the experts that were consulted for research on this podcast really believe that a year is extremely optimistic, and maybe a year and a half, 2 years. And we may not be able to take the kinds of precautions that we ordinarily take in less serious times in developing and testing the vaccine. It may have to be fast-tracked. So you have to have some kind of a risk analysis on that and see what makes sense. So that's the first sobering understanding that we need to accept. The next one has to do with how soon we open up our society, our stores and restaurants and artistic venues and sports and all. And this is equally sobering. I mean, basically the idea is that that we will eventually, apparently no sooner than August, September. That's what he predicts, if we're going to do things safely. But even then, what will happen is, so we'll open up society perhaps incrementally, perhaps some stores will be open. I'm not sure how they'll work out those logistics, but first, we're not going to be able to open up completely when we do. And the second part of this is that it's not as if like, well, we open up everything and everything returns to the way it was before this pandemic. What we should expect for the next year or two or three or even four is that that we'll have to go through a series of openings and closings. We will open up society, business for a while, and it will be inevitable that the number of deaths and cases of coronavirus will increase during that time. And we have to monitor that. And at a certain point, we have to then close society and business again. And we may have to do this 3 or 4 times, again, during, or more, I don't know, during the next 2-3 years. And so, it's, all right, so that's the information that, and again, like, I don't do the podcast justice. I mean, toward the end, it gets perhaps unnecessarily mundane or pessimistic, but for the most part, especially in the beginning, the information is so important for you to know, for you to be able to navigate this next year and the following year reasonably, according to what seems likely to be. So again, the title of the podcast is The Daily, and it's published by the New York Times. And the title of this particular episode is The Next Year or Two of the Pandemic. And the expert or the reporter that's consulted, his name is Donald G. McNeil Jr., and he's a science and health reporter for the New York Times. This is a New York Times podcast. And again, it was published on Monday, April 20th. So, all right, well, I can't, it's hard to acknowledge all that and begin to prepare for it without considering some spiritual implications that really no one wants to acknowledge or face. And the idea, and some people don't believe in God, and here in the United States, I think about 80-90% of us believe in God or a higher power. We may not believe everything that the Bible says. I certainly don't believe that Jonah was swallowed up by a big fish, or that the earth is 6,000 years old. There's a lot in the Bible that I would prefer to rely on science for my truth in such cases. But I think what the Bible does teach, and what religions tend to teach, monotheistic religions, is that we have a God who loves us and who rewards and punishes us according to what we do. Just like a parent out of love will punish a child to teach that child a better way that will serve that child better in the future, and also to just safeguard the welfare of others, so the child isn't hurting others either. Well, this coronavirus pandemic is so clearly the result. This, if you want to look at it in a spiritual way, have some spiritual reasoning, it is so clearly the result of our decades and decades long maltreatment of farm animals. As an example, they will keep a female pig, a sow, in a gestation crate, a crate so small that this sow cannot even turn around for months and months at a time. They'll keep chickens cramped in a cage, a foot by a foot by a foot, maybe 3 or 4 or 5 chickens there. They don't have enough room to spread their wings, and they're kept there for weeks at a time. This is just a small example of the horrible abuse that these farm animals go through and have been going through for year after year, decade after decade. And the clerics, our clerics don't talk about it, our politicians don't talk about it. You know, it's like we're in this collective spiritual denial. Why don't clerics, why don't rabbis and ministers and priests talk about this? You know, it's hard to believe that they don't get it, that they don't see how immoral, you know, how this is like so much more even immoral than slavery. And we all know how immoral slavery was. My guess is that they are afraid to confront their congregations. The congregations are, you know, leaving religion, and they're thinking to themselves, well, you know, this would be too much for them to accept. But, you know, religions, whether it's Christianity, Judaism, whatever, that abandons morality, you know, for the sake of numbers, for the sake of inclusion, I think it's a misguided approach. You know, I think it's better to champion what's right, what's necessary, what's moral. And yeah, if people, you know, can't accept that, well, that becomes a challenge. It's, you know, I don't think it's wise or practical to simply keep congregations together, having them all believe that they are such virtuous people, you know, virtually all of them who were complicit in this torture of animals by eating meat and dairy and eggs. And, you know, I may have other misgivings, but that's not one of them. I've been a vegan for 15 years and a vegetarian since 92. I've understood this, and it boggles the mind how people don't get, you know. Back in 92, a friend of mine kind of like reminded me of what I already knew back then, you know, but like having been confronted, and he was like really sober about it. He was just, you know, he wasn't threatening. He was just, you know, reminding me of the pain, the suffering these animals go through. And like that day, you know, I didn't even wait a day. That day I turned vegetarian. And then years later, I had thought that the dairy cows and the chickens, the egg-laying chickens, were treated better, you know. And then I learned more, and I realized that actually in some cases they're treated worse. Let me give you an example. So that's when I became vegan. Let me give you an example of how criminal and how immoral our factory farm system is. And this is to a great extent because the industry, the factory farm industry, creates the laws that govern that industry. That through their lobbyists, they pretty much determine what is the law. And let me give you a perfect example. You may have like an airplane hangar sized enclosure, okay, with tens of thousands of chickens, and these chickens stay in this enclosure for weeks at a time, for basically almost their entire lives, and they're urinating and defecating on the floor, and the stench is so strong that the workers there have to have masks, you know, because it would burn their eyes, and they wouldn't be able to breathe if they didn't have some kind of a respirator mask. And then the real criminal aspect of this is like, let's say that airplane hangar sized enclosure with tens of thousands of chickens has a doorway that leads to a plot of grass. And that plot of grass, I believe, my recollection was that it had to be, let's say, 12 feet by 12 feet by 12 feet, a very small enclosure. But that's not the point, because the idea is like, you know, as long as they had this doorway to this grassy area that was very small, they could call these chickens free range. You know, so some people, believing they're doing something compassionate, you know, choose to buy free range, quote unquote, free range chickens that actually have been raised in this kind of environment. You know, it's beyond horrible. And, you know, it's beyond understanding how our society, our world has continued for decade and after decade after decade, long after we've been rich enough, certainly as a country, and I think to a certain extent as a world, to, and it's not just a matter of rich enough. I mean, basically, we have the science and the knowledge to know how to get proper nutrition without having to rely on animal meat and dairy and eggs. I mean, this is something we've known. I mean, some of our top athletes are vegans. They don't eat any of that. So, all right, let me just shift now to what our salvation is, because we're seriously being punished, and it seems to me, you know, if you believe in God and justice and mercy for those animals and mercy for future generations, you know, so our kids and grandkids and great grandkids won't have to endure these pandemics. If you believe in that, then you have to understand that we have to change our ways profoundly. In a sense, that we have to end factory farming. Not just factory farming, we have to end the farming of animals, you know, chickens, pigs, all of them. And I mean, it's kind of, it's a godsend in a sense that this, I mean, we're in 2020, 7 years before this pandemic, we achieved a milestone in food production, in science. And that was the year that a scientist, Dr. Mark Post from the Netherlands, demonstrated to the world that it is possible to grow meat that's completely safe from the risk of pandemics in a laboratory. Sergey, and I've said this before, I'm going to keep saying it because this is the answer to what we're going through. It's not the answer to this current crisis, you know, the distancing and all needs to be done, but it's the answer to preventing future ones. And if we don't get this, then, you know, who knows what will happen. So Sergey Brin, who's a co-founder of Google, financed this research. He, you know, it's about $1 million. It was $300,000 to develop each hamburger patty. And since then, there are now about 40 or 50 startups that are researching ways to manufacture, produce meat, fish, dairy, eggs, you know, beef, pork, chicken, all these animal products they can safely produce in labs. Now the problem is, and say what I mean by safe is not just limited to safely avoiding pandemics. This is a way to be healthier. You know, so much of what's in meat and dairy and eggs is not healthy for us, and they cannot. This is not genetic modification, but they can engineer the process of growing this meat, you know, so that it's much healthier for us as individuals. So this is, you know, this is such a a positive win-win in every way, really. So here's the problem. You know, at the rate of research, with the rate of funding that is going into these startups, you know, we may be lucky to have these products in supermarkets at competitive prices in 10 years. There have been predictions of that are sooner, but it's hard to tell because certain research challenges have to be overcome, have to be succeeded with. Now, considering that this is really our only, there are two ways that we can prevent future pandemics. You know, one is by perfecting this what it's known as cultured meat, perfecting this process, and again, I said it before, I'll say it again. We just spent $2.2 trillion on this, basically addressing the effects of this coronavirus, and we're going to spend I think another 500 billion, and I think we spent perhaps more than 500 before. So this may get to $3, $4, $5 trillion before we're done spending, and our government has not spent a penny on this cultured meat research, and that's just like so absolutely stupid and immoral and just like irresponsible. It's beyond comprehension. So you know, we you know, you know, you have to hold our leaders accountable because they're not leading. You know, they think, well, oh, people, you know, aren't comfortable with this processed food. You know, that it's so unnatural. And no, I mean, like, you know, the reality is we're living in a very unnatural. If you're living in a house or an apartment, you have indoor plumbing and indoor heat and lighting and refrigeration, and, you know, our entire world is extremely unnatural, but it makes us, you know, it's good for us, and our food processes. And if you look at any of the breakfast cereals, for example, you'll see chemicals in there that you can't pronounce. So this process is no more, quote unquote, unnatural than how we produce our food now. And again, you know, basically, since it's taking a cell, the process is they take a single cell from an animal and trick it into believing that it's still in the animal, and then they grow it in a medium. And the nutrients they feed it are so much healthier than what they feed these cows, for example, in stock farms. They can feed these cells and create an environment where not only are these pandemics essentially impossible, but the foods that we will create, the meat, the fish, the dairy that we'll create, will have less or no saturated fat, will have nutrients. They can fortify these foods with nutrients that are not found in our meat and dairy and eggs. So it's a complete win-win. And you know, again, you know, if you want to know why we're in a mess like this, I mean, you'll read articles in the newspaper about this cultured meat, very few. You'll read articles about now recently linking factory farming to pandemics like this. Again, very, very few. But you won't see any articles. I haven't seen a single one that says, well, you know, the only way to prevent future pandemics is to end the farming of animals and transition to lab-grown cultured meat, fish, and dairy and eggs and all. And then the last part of this, you know, the media should begin to cover is that the only way, you know, again, if it's left to the funding levels that they have now, it may take over 10 years to perfect this technology. If we pump $10 billion, 20, 30, I mean, like 10 billion would probably be enough. But I mean, considering that we just spent 2.2 trillion on this economic stimulus and not a penny on this research is bizarre. It's immoral. So if we were to spend this $10 billion on this research, it could be very probable that we would have these products on supermarket shelves as we're moving away from this pandemic. In other words, like we're finally back to normal, and we could create a world where we don't have to worry about influenza type pandemics anymore. Even like, you know, you're familiar with recalls of meat because of, you know, E. coli, and then there's like recalls because of salmonella. This new cultured meat technology protects against those too. You know, these are bacterial infections a lot of times. So, you know, it's, I didn't intend to go show after show, as I seem to have been doing, dwelling on this, but, you know, this is where we are. I mean, anything else that I would say would be so much less useful, so much less important. We still, you know, I'm going to address the emotional aspects of this. We're going to have to, you know, learn how to maintain our happiness and you know, control of our anxiety and just our mental health, our emotional health over these next months and years. But we have to address this, you know, this safeguarding our world against future pandemics. Or it's a minute and 27 seconds left. Like I turn my TV back on because that's, you know, that's like my monitor when I turn this recording off. So let me just, before we end, the podcast that I mentioned was published by the New York Times on April 20th. And the name of the podcast is The Daily. The title of the episode is The Next Year, parentheses, or two, close parentheses, of the pandemic. And the guest health and science reporter is Donald G. McNeil Jr. Again, you need to see this because it's a 25-minute podcast, and you will, after, you know, after seeing this, I hope you understand that we can't live in a world where we have to, we're constantly, you know, fearing the next pandemic. We have to like do what we need to do. All right, this is George Ortega. And again, I guess, well, I've got about 16 seconds left. You know, again, you know, I hope you understand the sober nature of this particular episode. But again, I hope you're maintaining your spirits and using platforms like Zooms to stay together. Okay, thanks. I'll see you tomorrow.